Merci beaucoup, monsieur le professeur. Je parlerai en anglais plutôt qu'en français. I would like to begin by expressing my thanks for the honor of this invitation to address the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco. And I would like to inscribe my comments today into more than 10 years of cooperation and collaboration, which my colleagues and I in Oxford have enjoyed with the Kingdom of Morocco through the partnership that we have enjoyed with the Moroccan British Society under their president, Her Highness Princess Lala Joumala, and who were responsible for establishing in Oxford His Majesty King Mohammed VI Chair in Moroccan and Mediterranean Studies, through whose auspices we've been able to maintain a very active and important exchange and connection with the Kingdom of Morocco through my colleague Michael Willis, who currently holds the chair. So it's a great pleasure to be back in Morocco and to be in this august assembly. One of the key themes in the social history of modernity is the transformation from animal power to mechanical power. And with the advent of oil, with the establishment of what we can call the hydrocarbon society. And so my focus today will be looking at the ways in which the First World War played a signal role in transforming the Middle East from an animal power to a hydrocarbon society. Now, the discovery of oil was one of the catalysts of modernity in the Middle East. It remains the region's most important global commodity and has brought tremendous wealth both to oil-producing countries and to labor-exporting countries right across the Middle East and North Africa. Yet at the time of its discovery, oil had relatively little importance compared with what it has today. It was used to power generators, it was used for fuel, to heat, it was used for lighting. It was only with the advent of oil-powered naval vessels and the creation of the internal combustion engine at the end of the 19th century that oil was transformed into a strategic commodity. The spread of the internal combustion engine, first through automobiles and then through aircraft, created ever greater demand for oil and for its refined products. Automobiles and aircraft were introduced to the Middle East well after they had made their first appearance in Europe and the United States. In Europe, the Benz company introduced the first mass-produced automobile in 1893, and car makers in Italy, in France, in Switzerland were quick to follow. In the United States, Henry Ford began building automobiles in 1896 and established his own company in 1903. And in the first decade of the 20th century, a number of major rivals emerged to Ford in the United States. Where did the slide changer go? Yolanda, do you have? Thank you. So the invention of the airplane followed the introduction of the automobile by 1 decade. The Wright brothers made their first flight with a heavier-than-air motor-powered machine in December 1903, when they piloted the first airplane on the beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their flight that day, their longest flight, lasted 59 seconds and covered a distance of under 300 meters. But over the next decade, the pioneers of aviation made remarkable advances in aircraft design. Louis Blériot introduced wing flaps to improve stability on his Berlioz 8 in 1908 and was the first to pilot an aircraft across the English Channel in the summer of 1909. These new machines, automobiles and airplanes, provoked fascination in the Ottoman Empire, but had been banned by Sultan Abdulhamid II until the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. And they were, as a result, slow to catch on in the European and Asian provinces, with their poor roads and medieval cities built to accommodate animals, not automobiles. The First World War was to transform the Ottoman Empire, from animal power to the beginnings of a hydrocarbon society. Faced with an enemy who dominated the skies with rapidly evolving aircraft and transported men and material over land at high speed in cars and trucks, the Ottomans were forced to catch up very quickly, to buy the vehicles and to train the men to drive them. What they started in wartime accelerated in peacetime to transform the Middle East into an ever-growing consumer of motor vehicles and a geostrategic air route between European metropoles and their colonies in Asia and Africa. Car enthusiasts brought the automobile to Istanbul in 1908. The first car to be driven on the streets of Istanbul was a small 9-horsepower deux Dion-Bouton one-cylinder car, which had great difficulty in traveling over the narrow, encumbered, ill-paved streets of the Ottoman capital and couldn't drive outside the streets of the city. It was really the lack of road networks which was to prove the greatest constraints on automobile traffic. The Ottoman road network as a whole was described by contemporaries as unfit for wheeled traffic. By 1914, there were 20,000 kilometers of highway constructed by the Ottoman Empire. However, the roads were only partly finished, they were badly maintained, and they became unusable because of lack of maintenance. These unpaved roads, constricted by a corvée system, were at most 6 meters wide, so very hard to accommodate wheeled traffic. The American consul in Istanbul reported in 1914, "In general, roads are bad, but near the large cities such as Constantinople, there are enough good ones to give automobiles a drive of a few miles without being unduly shaken." These first exhibitions demonstrated the potential of motor transport to transform time and distance. Until this point, Ottoman mapmakers measured distance not in kilometers, but in hours. They literally measured the distance across terrain by the number of hours it took one to travel overland by animal. With the advent of mechanized transport, this notion of judging distance by time would rapidly give way by making tracks over distance at great speed. The diffusion of automobiles in Ottoman domains was slow, but accelerating, with Istanbul in the lead. In the years after 1908, a wide range of European and American cars made their way onto the carriage roads of the Ottoman capital. American officials estimated that 2/3 of the cars in the Ottoman Empire were of European manufacture and only 1/3 of American manufacture. And of course, for the American consuls, always interested in the commercial possibilities for their country's industrial exports, that was what they followed most closely. But as a result, the American archives are a very good source for the early history of motorized transport in the Ottoman Empire. And they kept statistics based on custom officials on the trend in American car sales in the years leading up to the First World War, which, as you'll see from the figures above, show a regular increase ranging from 50 to 100% per year, with the exception of 1913, where the market was depressed by the Balkan Wars. By 1914, trucks and buses began to compete with automobiles for space on the narrow roads of Istanbul, bringing one of the great annoyances of the modern age to the Ottoman capital: traffic. An American consular official wrote lyrically on the eve of war in July 1914, "Progress, that is what is going on, and automation is one of the forms of it." To think that motor cars were generally forbidden in the Ottoman Empire until 1908, and then to look around the streets of Constantinople today with its limousines, touring cars, motor trucks, gasoline-driven delivery wagons, and hospital ambulances, practically all imported within the last 3 years, is to understand the very rapid development of this trade. Now, this was not at all the case in Anatolia or in the Arab provinces. where the figures for Turkey and Asia show far fewer cars sold, only 11 cars compared to 81 in Istanbul. The government had taken initiative to expand city streets and to connect towns and cities by better highways. And so all of the major towns of Asia were engaged in street widening and public improvements, but street widening in the ancient cities of the Arab world was very difficult because, again, we must remember, these were streets made for animal traffic. To widen them means to tear down shops and houses. In 1914, there were no cars at all in Harput. There were 4 American calls in Trabzon, 4 in Samsun, 5 or 6 in Izmir or Smyrna, only 4 in Konya. There were 2 consular cars in Beirut, and the Russian consul in Messina claimed to have owned a Fiat. So with such small numbers of cars, it was hardly worth the effort or the disturbance to be tearing down houses and shops to widen roads. A good example is Baghdad. In response to a query from the Packard Motor Company, dated the 12th of February 1914, the U.S. consul literally counted on one hand the number of cars in Baghdad. He writes, "I see no chance for an extensive sale of automobiles in this district at the present." He's had a number of queries from American exporters, and he answered them all in the same way. He said there was 1 motor car owned by a private company based in Baghdad. The Governor General owned 2 cars in Baghdad for his private use. There were also 2 other automobiles which were to be used for passenger traffic between Baghdad and Bakuba, 25 miles away. But both because they didn't have good drivers to drive them and because they had terrible roads to navigate, the cars were constantly being broken down and were not serviceable. But there were at most 5 cars to be found in the whole of the province of Baghdad by February of 1914. The airplane made its first appearance in the Ottoman Empire in the Young Turk age as well. As I've already said, aviation was still in its infancy at this point, and it wasn't until July of 1909 that Louis Blériot brought the first airplane over the skies of Istanbul. This was after he'd made his channel crossing, and so there was great excitement about his arrival. But in the event, he flew into strong winds, and his airplane crashed into the roof of an Istanbul house. The famous pilot spent the next 3 weeks in a hospital recovering from his injuries. It was an inauspicious start and a reminder of how dangerous mechanized flight was. The first Turkish pilots were sent for training in Europe in 1911, and by 1914, Turkish pilots were beginning to claim the skies over Istanbul. In February of that year, Lieutenant Fethi Bey, accompanied by one of Enver Pasha's aides, Sadık Bey, attempted to fly from Istanbul across Anatolia through Syria to Egypt as a way of trying to claim all of the skies of the Ottoman Empire through one bold flight. Their plane was a Blériot designed. It was named the Muaweneti Milliye, or the National Assistance. It covered a 25-mile leg in about 21 minutes, so it was flying at about 60 miles an hour. Crowds on the ground, many of them seeing air traffic for the first time, applauded at the marvel. But it was, as I said, dangerous flying at that time. While the pilots reached Damascus safely, their airplane experienced engine difficulties on the flight to Jerusalem and crashed east of the Sea of Galilee, killing both pilots. Sadık Bey and Fethi Bey are remembered as the first shaheeds of Ottoman flight. They're buried now in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. In June 1914, American aviator John Cooper demonstrated the Curtiss flying boat to audiences outside of Istanbul, setting the precedent for using aircraft that could land and take off on water in a country that had no airfields. It was a great success and generated a great deal of favorable press, but it was to demonstrate the great limits of the Ottoman mechanized experience by the time they entered the First World War. With the outbreak of war in July 1914 and the Ottoman entry into that war in November of that year, the automobile was transformed from a luxury import into a strategic necessity. The Young Turk government requisitioned virtually every motor vehicle in private hands and turned to its German and Austrian allies to provide cars and trucks for military use. They also invested a lot of their resources in cars. In January 1916, the American consul reported that the Ottoman government had spent $11 million, an enormous sum, on motor vehicles, which he claimed was indicative of the country's adaptability to modern means of conveyance. And we can see here from a photograph taken in Jerusalem around 1916, if you look in the background, you'll notice that all of the wheeled traffic is still horse-drawn. This is still the age of the carriage. Now, one of the first challenges, if you wanted to go from carriages to motor vehicles, was to train drivers for the new cars. Already by 1914, the Istanbul Police Academy was training 200 drivers to drive new police cars for the municipality. But with the advent of the war, the need for drivers expanded massively. A military automobile school was established to train drivers, turning out a large number of men trained to a higher level of efficiency. Motor vehicles soon proved their value on the battlefield as well. Trucks to transport men, ambulances to carry away the wounded, armored cars armed with machine guns as weapons of war in their own right. But the same constraints on civilian traffic applied to military vehicles. Poor roads and the lack of facilities for maintenance and upkeep put a real limit on how far cars could drive. And here we have a picture of the Ottoman leader, Cemal Pasha, driving around the area around Jerusalem in a motor car. Horses remained more common than cars in the Arab provinces. Tanks deployed in Gaza fared very badly, but those landscapes with dry weather proved conducive to motorized vehicle. The British, you may recall, contributed armored cars to the Arab revolt in the Hijaz, and the British deployed massive numbers of armored cars in Mesopotamia's later stages. Baghdad, which we spoke about earlier, provides an excellent example of the restructuring of Arab cities to accommodate mechanized vehicles. Tenaciously defended by the Ottomans for the first half of the war, Baghdad fell to Anglo-Indian forces in March of 1917. The British converted the ancient city into the advanced staging post for operations for the remainder of the Mesopotamia campaign. To do so, its streets had to be made fit for cars. The average street in Baghdad was only 10 feet wide. In many places, houses were built close enough for their eaves to touch, creating the shade under which walkers could get protection from the sun in the violent heat of Mesopotamia. Under the Ottoman government's street widening initiatives, the local authorities had already begun to try and create a north-south axis running through the city of Baghdad, parallel to the Tigris River. This involved the tearing down of streets and of shops, but ran into an obstruction when they reached the property of the British consulate, which ran for nearly 400 meters from the river shore inland. On the outbreak of hostilities between the Ottomans and the Ottomans no longer faced that obstruction and cut their road right through the middle of the British consulate's grounds. The new road, averaged about 50 feet in width, was named after the Ottoman governor Halil Pasha, came to be known as Halil Pasha Jaddasi. When the British conquered Baghdad in 1917, they took their revenge on the destruction of their consular grounds by renaming Halil Pasha Jaddasi the more mundane New Street, but note, in English, New Street. 3 months after they occupied the city, the American consul there reported that groups of Indian workmen were constantly leveling and improving the street, which is used a great deal by automobile and other wheeled traffic. Great quantities of automobiles, auto trucks, and motorcycles have been brought into the country by the British Army. And again, you have a picture to give you a sense of a great number of automobiles. The native population, the consul wrote, is becoming accustomed to this quick mode of transport, and undoubtedly the influence will be felt long after the war has ended. So the commercially minded American consul is always thinking about the opportunities for American industry that will follow this war. They saw a future for automobiles by 1917 that was not apparent in 1914. Indeed, the Americans, and here we have the British bringing a car into Damascus. But the Americans would finally get their market for commercial cars on a massive scale. Here, an advertisement from the Turkish magazine at this point, Servet-i Fünun, from the 1920s, showing a Studebaker for sale to the readers of Servet-i Fünun. Now, very briefly, the development of the airplane is a rather different story, and as one follows through the history of the First World War in the Middle East, one can follow the evolution of the airplane as an instrument primarily used for aerial surveillance. This was the opportunity for the first time in warfare for antagonists to be able to actually view their enemies' front lines with certainty, and they did so by airplanes. But of course, when you had airplanes from rival alliances trying to view each other's front lines, you had a motive to try and deter your enemy. And so they started mounting machine guns on airplanes. Then you had airplanes evolving from peaceful camera-wielding airplanes to airplanes that would begin to shoot each other in the air and shoot soldiers on the ground. And we even have examples of the first aerial bombardment in the siege of Kut in Mesopotamia in 1916, where British soldiers saw a very fast German monoplane fly over their besieged town and watched with interest as it dropped 4 silver objects that shined in the sunlight. They didn't have the good sense to take cover from the high explosive 200-pound bombs that were dropped on them, but that was to become a regular part of the siege of Kut and the birth of the aerial bombardment. The British even tried to use airplanes to provide food for their besieged and starving soldiers in Kut el Amara, but the aircraft were too weak to cover enough weight of food to be able to give them the calories it took. And long before the Berlin airdrop, you had the Kut airdrop, which was unsuccessful. So while airplanes evolved very rapidly in the course of the war and were to become an ever more common sight, it was really only in the aftermath of the war that the airplane came into its own as an object of repression that the British used time and again. Here we see a British plane flying over Jerusalem in the 1920s. The British used aircraft to put down both uprisings in tribes in Transjordan in the 1920s, and with more violence, to put down the Iraqi revolt of 1920, and in using gas against Kurdish uprisings later in the 1920s. So where you didn't want to commit many troops, you used air power. But it was the post-war conversion from military to civilian aviation that took place in the 1920s and 30s that was really the most important change that took the Middle East out of a category of a consumer market and made it into an area of geostrategic importance. The airplane, I would argue, redefined the geostrategic importance of the Middle East as a crossroad of air routes to Britain's empire in both Africa via Egypt, and here you have the map of the air routes of Imperial Airlines, which would later become the BOAC and then British Airways, and also to India and Australasia via Iraq, Bahrain, and the Trucial States. And while it's difficult for you to read on that map, the points in the Middle East go right through the possessions that Britain had claimed for itself, from Baghdad to Kuwait to Bahrain to Sharjah, and down into India from there. And colonial rule in this way reinforced by transport technology of the modern age and geostrategic air routes linking the empire, justifying Great Britain to continue to extend its control well after the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Thank you very much.